people. Damon's going to introduce Ron, and we're going to get
Okay, what's a lot of excitement today. Anyway, I had this long speech made up. I think I'll shorten it. Just say that it's a special treat today to have Ron Hofmann speak. Ron and I have known each other over 30 years, and it's hard to believe because we look so young. Anyway, Ron, since the energy crisis of 2000 and 2001, he's been really focused on helping the state of California solve some of his energy problems. And in his capacity, he's an advisor to the California Energy Commission, forming research programs in energy. And a lot of those projects actually end up on CITRIS here. I think over 24 grad students and maybe even up to a dozen faculty members. So let's give a warm welcome to Ron. He's going to talk about a perspective on energy challenges in California and the United States.
Well, you're all very persistent, and that's great, and I hope I don't disappoint you. I have a lot of slides, but a lot of the slides are going to be just skipped over because they'll be posted, and there's a lot of information on it that I thought you might benefit from long term. But what I'm going to try to do today is tell a story and try to get you in the mood of what's going on right now with respect to energy in California, demand response, whatever that means. And I am going to spend a bit of time defining things. And that's what I'm hoping you'll get out of today. That's one of the things that I think is very important for you to get out of today, is to get used to the jargon, get used to the understanding of what these problems are all about and how people talk about them. And as sort of an added little treat, I'm going to give you my perspective on the energy challenge. And of course, that's probably not consistent with some of the stakeholders that I'll talk about today. So this will be something that will be a little bit different from what maybe some other people have in terms of their point of view. So my agenda today is to give you a little bit of history, mostly in storytelling mode. I'm going to intersperse that history with some definitions. So the definitions don't come all at once. They come when I think you need them in this little story. I'm going to focus on the California energy crisis, and there are a number of people in this room that if I flub up and say something that's not quite right, they'll be able to correct me, but I lived through part of this as they did. And then I'd like to give you a perspective of what I think California's energy challenges are going forward. And they're going to be different from what I think you hear other people talk about and what's in the news all the time having to do with renewables and other issues. And then I want to provide a milestone for you all to make you understand that the PIER program, which I will define in my talk, has been doing some really good things. This is a program that the state runs, and there's been lots of good research being done at UC Berkeley and LBNL to address the crisis. And then finally, if you all can stay a little bit longer, there will be a Q&A session with some backup slides if that interests you. So I am a technology entrepreneur. I have been a serial entrepreneur since I was 11 years old. And I started companies while I was going to school here at Berkeley. I had a drafting company, if you know what drafting is. I had a T-square and triangles and all that sort of thing, and I kept busy for 6 years. Since 1970, I've been involved in the energy space, primarily in the electricity world, and I've done everything from being involved in performing and managing contract R&D. I've started a number of companies. I've developed hardware and software products. My first software company actually started in June of 1970. So software companies go back quite a way. And I've also done a lot of business consulting. I work for a number of VCs. My objective here today might be unusual because in providing you this background, I'm asking you to do something going forward. I want to provide a context in which you can make contributions. This is very important to me. It's really important that the students and professors that are involved at this university pay attention to the energy problems, and particularly the electricity problems. And so that's my hope, is that some of the things I'll say today will get you interested in doing things. So I'm going to start a little bit with history. Again, I'm not going to read the slides. I'm going to go through slides fairly quickly, but I want to call out certain things to get your attention. And typically on my slides, those will be in red. And so the most important thing that I want you to remember today is that what's going on today started for us really in 1973. And in 1973, if you were around at that time, I know some of you weren't even born at that time, there was what we called the oil shock, called the oil embargo. And during that time, we had our first taste of very long lines at filling stations to get gasoline. There were situations in which whether your license plate was odd or even, you went on different days. So there was a lot of things happening. And it was the birth of energy efficiency in California. It was the birth of the California Energy Commission, which was founded a couple of years after that, or a year or so after that. Those of you that know what the Rosenfeld effect was at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, where Art Rosenfeld walked around and started turning off lights that weren't being used, and people found out that, my God, you can really save electricity. And then it was also the birth of Title 20 and Title 24 through the California Energy Commission in the subsequent years. As a result of California's efforts in this area, today, as compared to the early 70s, California has arguably avoided 30 gigawatts, that's 30,000 megawatts of generation being invested in. Because if you look at this picture, which you have, I'm sure, seen before, the lower line represents California maintaining the same electricity per person through a lot of different means. It wasn't only our energy efficiency standards, but through a lot of different things. And yet California has been the leader in the United States in terms of an active economy. So during the boom years of the late 80s and the early 90s, if you go back, and I'm not an economist, but I've read about this, Silicon Valley was driving the value proposition for the whole United States. Doesn't mean that the automobile industry wasn't part of this, but the growth that we experienced during that time was coming from California. So during this time, the rest of the United States was increasing their electricity per person at about 2% per year. You do the math and you find out that California saved about, it has 50% less generation required today than if they had followed the average for the United States. In the 70s and 80s, you're probably aware we were deploying nuclear power plants. That's approximately 20% of today's supply. But by putting in those power plants, those nuclear power plants, something changed that hadn't existed before the 70s. Before the 70s, as the utilities built generation, our costs actually went down. And around the 70s, we hit the bottom of that and started going back up, and the deployment of nuclear power plants was one contributing factor to that. Of course, there was increased costs for oil, there was a lot of other things, but this is an important part of the history, is to understand that there was a period in the 70s and 80s when we were building a bunch of nuclear power plants, and our costs started to rise. Also, in the 80s and 90s, we started becoming more aware of the environmental impacts of what we were doing in generating electricity. And those of you that remember, there were acid rain problems in the northeastern part of the United States that were quite severe. Anybody that lived in that area had to deal with that. There was strip mining from coal, which was an environmental problem that was big in that period. Global warming was just sort of a few people really understood that this was starting to happen. And during this period was a very robust period of development of renewables. And our utility here, PG&E, in their research labs in San Ramon, was a major contributor towards what we are benefiting in terms of solar power and wind power and other renewables today. They did a lot of the research that eventually went on to get us to where we are today. Final history slide is that the next red text said 1996 was the next big event that you need to remember. 1973 was the oil shock. 1996, we deregulated the electricity market. And what we deregulated was the wholesale electricity market, the supply market. And 4 years later, we had a crisis. After deregulation, there was a few years of calm, and then this crisis hit. People like Severin Bornstein, Professor Bornstein here, I think anticipated all of this. They knew when the deregulation was occurring, they knew that there was flaws in deregulation. And the one thing that Severin has said to me, just the disconnect between the wholesale and the retail prices was a big issue. What that means is that the wholesale prices were varying, and we as consumers always saw flat rates. So there was no balance of supply and demand to the end user. The utilities were tasked with keeping the supply-demand balance in place. And companies like Enron figured out how to game it, both legally and illegally. So those of you that think this was all illegal, no, deregulation was flawed. There was some legal gaming, and they were able to disrupt our system. And that led to the summer of 2000. And in the summer of 2000, the California Independent System Operator, ISO, had 32 stage 1 alerts, which means that they dropped below 7% reserves. They also had 17 stage 2 alerts, which meant they dropped below 5%. They actually had to shed firm load in San Francisco in June 14th of that year. The whole Western grid was having problems. Most of us didn't know about it, but as we go back and look at what was happening during that time, we can find that there were some pretty scary times when things could have collapsed, but because we have really good talent in this state that never really gets recognized at places like the Cal ISO, they kept the system going. The real problems that you and I observed happened actually in the winter of 2000 to 2001, when we had on December 7th our first stage 3 alert, and the Department of Water Resources had to drop 200 megawatts of pumping load. They're the people who run the water system, the canals, and there's a lot of electric pumps there. Now, depending on who you talk to, the governor has said that 19% of all of our electricity in the state goes to managing the water system. At the very least, I've heard from, I think, reputable sources that somewhere between 5 and 10% of our electric load is wrapped up in these pumps that are managing our water in the water system. And if people have better numbers during the question and answer period, they could correct me. Starting in December, we had 20 consecutive days of stage 1 or stage 2 alerts, and then we started having rolling blackouts or rotating blackouts in the following year, early in 2001. And it identifies there some of the days that that happened. So I'm stopping the story for a moment, and I'm going to give you some definitions so we can go forward with the story and be a lot smarter about what the story means. So the first thing I want to make sure we all understand together is what was and what is an electric utility. Might not seem like something, people might think, gee, we all know that. We may not. Pre-1996, before deregulation, electric utilities were vertically integrated. That means they provided the supply, the generation, they supplied all of the transmission distribution and all of the demand management. And it was basically a one-way large central generation, transmission, distribution, and load system. Post-1996, one component of that was taken away from the utilities, and that was the wholesale supply. And it meant that wholesale and retail supplies were disconnected. Two different organizations were involved in it. The wholesale part was basically deregulated on a national scale, and what was left for the utilities was to become essentially power delivery companies. So that's what this first bullet on this next slide says. And then between 1996 and 2000, the utilities were directed to sell off all of their generation assets. And thank goodness that went slow, because PG&E never sold off their nuclear and their hydro. And when the crisis hit, that's what essentially got us back on our feet. The people that bought these assets were people like Enron. There were a lot of other companies, Dynergy, Williams, these are names of that period. But you all know Enron, so that's why I put that as the example. And thank goodness again that the nuclear and hydro assets were not sold. So within these utilities, there's another subset of categorizations that you have to understand. Again, as we go forward and tell the story, which I'll get back to in a minute, you have to understand that there's sort of two types of utilities. There's the utilities that are investor-owned utilities, where the investors make the investments in the infrastructure that you and I use, but they have a regulated rate of return. And that regulated rate of return is managed by the California Public Utilities Commission. The investor-owned utilities in the state are called IOUs, and they are shown there in that first bullet: PG&E, Southern California Edison, SDG&E, and Southern California Gas. Some of them are what are called combo utilities, which mean they do both electric and gas. Some of them are either electric or gas. And on the electric side, they basically serve 75 to 80% of the state's electric load. The publicly owned utilities, of which there are many more, like 10 times more, are companies that are owned by the people who, in fact, get the service. Sacramento Municipal Utility District, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, et cetera, some of those others. Those are public utilities. SMUD and LADWP is as large as the smallest of the electric utilities on the IOU side. So they're approximately the same size as SDG&E, which has about 1 million customers. Nationally, even though in our state 70–80% are basically the IOUs, nationally it's about a 50-50 split. That number's maybe a little bit old. I don't know with some of the mergers whether some of this has changed, but about 300 IOUs represent about 50% of the load, plus or minus 10, and about 3,000 POUs, publicly owned utilities, serve the other 50% or plus or minus 10%. And again, if somebody wants to bring up the correct numbers at the question and answer. The final form of definitions that I think is necessary before I go back to the story is you need to make the distinction in your mind between energy and demand. They have different units and they mean different things. What you use to run your appliances are energy, and you get charged kilowatt hours for that. That happens to be the units. There could be other units, but those are the units we use. A typical home is 500 to 1,000 kilowatt hours. That's probably the bell curve within 1 sigma, something like that. And typical refrigerator, just to give you a sense, is something less than 100 kilowatt hours per month. Demand, which is actually what's driving this crisis right now, not necessarily energy, but demand. Demand is in units of kilowatts, and it's another name for capacity or power that you hear. Keep those concepts separate in your mind, because the solutions, for one, although they overlap the other energy solutions, overlap some of the demand problems, but demand solutions also overlap energy. They are distinctly different in terms of the strategies and the challenges that the state has. So a typical air conditioner is about a 3 to 5 kW demand device. When it turns on, it is drawing, in terms of demand, 3 to 5 kilowatts. So understand that. You also know about your bulbs, 100 watt bulbs versus 23 watt bulbs. You then they're on constantly at that value unless they're dimmed, and that would give you the energy if you took it over time. Back to the story. So when we left the story, we had a crisis, and the crisis was causing rolling blackouts. What was the problem? The problem was that demand, your need for capacity, was outstripping the supply for whatever reason, because people were holding back their supply to get a higher price for the energy, right? Not for the demand, but they were holding back the capacity to do that. They're linked. And in the summer, California has a huge air conditioning load that increases the demand by 50%. The energy tracks with it, sort of, but not exactly. In the winter, we also have demand problems, and that's actually where we had our rolling blackouts, because that was part of the gaming. In the winter, we normally have plant maintenance. So some of the gaming that occurred during the winter, legal or illegal, I don't know, was because people were saying, our plant needs more maintenance, or we have to keep it out of service. And all of a sudden, we didn't have enough capacity to meet a much lower load in the winter. California is a very diverse state, extremely diverse state. One of the statements that's made both about PG&E's territory, which is about 2/3 of the state geographically, and the whole state as a whole, is that it's a paradigm for the United States. Every geographical condition, every climate condition exists in California that exists elsewhere. And I'm always challenged on that based on the fact that Tampa is the center for lightning strikes in the United States, and they say, well, there's nothing like that in California. Wrong. We have that kind of density in the Sierras. So PG&E, even though it's small populations, not like Tampa, we still have those conditions. So California is very diverse, and if you look at this color-coded chart, you'll see that we have some very hot red zones, and this is where our air conditioning load is. But, you know, there's a diverse load structure in the state. Well, this is what the state looks like over a year. This was 2006. And this is what normally happens during most of the year, except when it gets real hot. And about half of these peaks which you'll notice if you look at the numbers is about 50% higher than the base load. Half of it almost is split between residential air conditioning and commercial. It's actually about 90% of that peak is split between those two. So there's a capacity problem in California. And the capacity problem actually dominates the energy problem in terms of building resources. Because the question becomes, do you have to have plants sitting around for this 50% increase that only need to be there for 1 to 3% of the year? So, options. Supply side options, build more plants, but they cost 10 times more than doing demand side options. If there had been some way to get a coordinated demand response, meaning that as the supply was going down and the price was going up associated with that supply because it was scarce, it would have only taken 5% demand response to have avoided the blackouts. That's an estimate that was given by the California Energy Commission during that period. Might have been just only 3%. Air conditioning during the summer is the low-hanging fruit, but the truth is, the big solution is, we need a system in the state that can respond automatically to whatever variations exist in the winter, summer, spring, fall, doesn't matter. And there needs to be a way of signaling devices that when there isn't enough supply, the low-value demand based on consumer choice gets dropped. And people aren't going to sit around and wait for a phone call to do that, so it needs to be automated. What is demand response? It's the action taken to reduce load when either contingencies occur or market conditions change to make prices higher. So these are the two things that demand response would be used for. And it involves these peak load reductions that you saw in that graph before. And you need to understand that demand response strategies are different from energy efficiency, just the same way that transient is different from permanent. That's the comparison. Demand response is a transient, or peak load issues are transient. Energy efficiency is 24/7, and that's how the two are different. They're related, and the same infrastructure can help both, but they're different in terms of how you respond. Your strategies are different. So in the past, before deregulation, when the utility was completely vertically integrated, they would offer users programs to get on to be able to manage this load. And one of the things they would do is they would give you $25 for the summer if you would join up and let them control your air conditioner. Typical demand response program of the late 70s, early 80s and 90s, or 80s and early 90s. After this wholesale supply side of this changed, in other words, it was deregulated nationally. Now the question became, would programs work? And there are a lot of people that are still proposing programs, but I'll leave it up to you to think about this and maybe talk to me offline as to why they won't work if, in fact, we have these transient events. It's going to be very hard and very expensive for people to build a control system to control your air conditioners under that environment. When they were vertically integrated and they knew they controlled the supply, it could be done. Now it's really not clear that it can be done. But what can be done is that signals can be sent to devices, machine-to-machine signals, in which the consumer has control over what your device does from your iPhone or whatever device you have. And those signals can help manage the energy with the utility through a communication link in which you have choice. So programs versus signals. Programs were very good up till 1996. They probably still have some role now. But in fact, we're going into a future where there are going to be signals that will allow your devices to know whether they should be on or off, or whether they're high value or low value. The DR vision is to create a real-time automated demand response infrastructure, and it has to be able to be something that can coexist with legacy systems, and it has to be future-proofed. Automated demand response is one of the programs that the California Energy Commission has been funding at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. It's called AutoDR. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's also something that caused a great fuss a couple years ago with Rush Limbaugh and others called programmable communicating thermostats. Programmable communicating thermostats are a device that will, in fact, be in the marketplace that will be used by consumers, probably not in the way that Rush Limbaugh described it. And there will also be capabilities where the utilities will actually still contract with you with programs to actually provide what's called spinning reserve from demand response. And these are things that I'll touch upon quickly to tell you what the future is going to be like. But here's the complication. This is really a complex space, huge complex space. Look at these stakeholders in California. There's energy companies, the people who actually provide that wholesale supply. There's the California Independent System Operator that balances supply and demand on the transmission level. There's utility distribution companies, that's the IOUs and POUs. And then there's customers, vendors, regulators, and so forth. It's complicated. It's not an open market. It's a partially regulated market. Look at these regulatory agencies that we have to deal with. On a national level, the Federal Energy Regulation Committee, Regulatory Commission. CPUC, California Public Utility Commission. California Energy Commission, CEC. Lots of regulatory bodies. In 2001, there was no infrastructure in place so that as people started to game the system, that you could quickly get a demand response to offset it. So the gamers would stop doing that. What we had was a bunch of things that took time. And one of the things we had were media hype. You know, Chicken Little, the roof's going to fall in, turn off stuff. And people did that because people are very good citizens in times of crisis, but it's not sustainable. The only thing that's sustainable is automation. And so what happened in 2001 led the California Energy Commission, under the direction of Art Rosenfeld, the commissioner, to start to put in place research programs that would try to start working with vendors, with people, to put automation in place so that we wouldn't have to rely on this list of things. This worked to a certain extent, but it was not sustainable, it was not persistent. One of the things they did in the first 2 years after the crisis was put an energy action plan in place. It failed. Why? There was no overall vision between the regulators and the utilities. They weren't on the same page. They put an integrated energy policy report together, and one of the good things that came out of that is it made energy efficiency and demand response at the top of the loading order. So what the commissions were saying is, no matter what, we're going to try to solve our problems with energy efficiency and demand response, and then renewables, and then traditional generation. So they weren't killing traditional generation, but they were saying they weren't high in the loading order. They worked on tariffs. Notice nothing red on here. I won't go over this in detail, but they started looking at very detailed types of tariffs, time of use rates, which don't change from day to day, with critical peak pricing, which had changes when you needed it, and could devices respond to that? There's a picture of what that might look like. What's down below here is a time of use rate for 1 day, and at night, notice how cheap it is. During most of the day, it's actually cheaper than a flat rate, but during the afternoon, on a hot afternoon, it's fairly high to give you an incentive to not use your air conditioner as much as you might. You can do it, and you just pay the price. But on a critical day, for a few hours, you may get a very high price, and that's called critical peak pricing. If you look at that same thing over a week, notice on the weekends you get the very low rates, so that's the time to do your laundry and all the big things that you can save for the weekend. But then each day you basically get a TOU rate until one day it's just too hot, and you get critical peak price, and then one time out of every 5 years, one time out of every 10 years, you get a reliability signal that says, we're about to have the grid crash. Would you rather keep your lights on and your computer going, or do you demand that you have all of these things operating, or would you rather have the whole thing go off? This is where the Rush Limbaugh thing came in. He didn't understand that that's what one of the misstated regulations was all about. So there's all sorts of tariffs. I'm not going to go through these, but I do want to say this. The future is that price and reliability signals are coming. Smart devices can help users manage everyday energy and peak demand. And one of the things that's going to happen is there definitely will be communicating thermostats. They already exist in the marketplace today. So 2 slides on my perspective, then a few more on technology, and I'll take some questions. Look, California has a peak load electricity problem. We have it. We got to deal with it. No matter who's upset about how they're getting solved, how the solutions are being presented, we have this problem. Wholesale supply is deregulated. You can't put that back in the bag. It's out. It's too expensive to build peaker plants, and the peaker plants are dirty, dirtier than other solutions. Baseload plants are a lot cleaner than peaker plants. Loads need to automatically respond to price. We need a real-time communicating infrastructure to deal with these issues. We need ways for information to flow back and forth. Some people are calling this the smart grid today. And inexpensive technology solutions are available, but the requirements are not clear. So there's still a problem with respect to that. Technology is not the problem. Notice, in red, technology is not the problem. System integration should be our focus because we have many technologies that can solve the problem today at no increase in technological costs. Hear that, no increase. We actually have data that shows that that's true. Standards are necessary. NIST is putting together smart grid initiatives that you probably have all read about in the paper. But the key thing that needs to be done, and I forgot to make that red, regulators should only define the what. One of the problems that has existed for the past few years is that regulators think they're smart enough to define the how. They don't understand it. They need to stay out of that. Industry absolutely knows how to do that. Industry doesn't know how to do the what. Regulators don't know how to do the how. People have got to keep that straight. Very important. However, regulators need to be taught technology. They can't do the what if they violate the second law of thermodynamics. Now, they're not going to do that, but it can amount to that. They do say things like the first energy action plan was simply stupid. It couldn't be achieved. And they didn't understand it because they didn't understand the technology. And the one thing that they are not, this will surprise you, they're not consumer focused. They're utility focused. That isn't what you read about in the paper, but that's the facts. The utilities come in there, make their case, and 9 times out of 10, they do exactly what the utilities say. Now, 8 times out of 10, the utilities are right. There's nothing wrong with the utilities. Utilities are very smart. But they have their agenda, and the consumers have nobody in there to protect it. Consumer organizations, they're useless. I told you you're going to hear some things that probably people aren't going to like. But there's some good news on the horizon. And this good news is the result of one of our attendees right here, Carl Blumstein and Art Rosenfeld, who isn't here, because they had the foresight back when there was deregulation to form PIER, Public Interest Energy Research. This was formed under, I believe it was formed under AB 1890, and it was implemented a couple years later. And what you're going to hear in the next couple of years is that PIER has done an amazing job to get ahead of the game, fund research that is societally important, and get the state ready for the change to an automated, information-rich infrastructure that can respond to signals. Currently, the R&D electricity funding, well, I shouldn't have had current there, that's a mistake. Initially, it was 62.5. There's been some stealing from the funds, so it's not 62.5 anymore. It's managed by the California Energy Commission, and the demand response work that I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes is part of the energy systems integration area if you're interested in that. A demand response program was developed that was built around the Demand Response Research Center at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. There is a long-term effort that goes on that Gaiman Yi manages, who's right there. There's a CERTS, Cal-ISO-focused research program that Joe Edo at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory is working on. There's a project called CSEM that Professor Borenstein here works on. And there's lots of other peer activities that work with the Demand Response Research Center. But out of the Demand Response Research Center, we've gotten something called OpenADR. OpenADR is one of the 16 standards that got onto the first NIST list. And that gives you an indication that this research that's being funded by PIER has been very, very important. It's being recognized on a national scale. And this is a tribute to Marianne Piet up at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of what it does, but it really attacks the low-hanging fruit in large commercial industrial facilities that have energy managers and energy management systems that can be signaled. The technology did not have to change in any way. You just had to create an infrastructure to give them price signals and reliability signals, And lo and behold, for the past 6 to 8 years, they have proven it's trivial. They don't have to change anything in their productivity, but they can respond to price and to reliability very effectively. And we can get significant demand reductions. We use a client-server, publish and subscribe paradigm. It's a very sophisticated system that works basically off the internet. Again, we can talk about the details offline. And look at the kinds of responses. This was an AutoDR event using OpenADR as the standard. And you can see that a whole bunch of loads absolutely reduce their loads during critical hot hours in the afternoon. To deal with residential, it's very complicated. It's much more complicated. There's 11 million residences in California. There's 25 to 30,000 large commercial industrial facilities. So residential is much more difficult. You probably have read that there's advanced metering infrastructures being put in for residences and small commercial. These are basically single-phase interval meters, whereas the large commercial industrial are three-phase interval meters. And they're putting in a communications infrastructure and back office software, and all of that infrastructure is being owned and invested in by the utilities. I think that's a very good thing. But inside the home, the utilities are still thinking the way they thought pre-1996. They still think they're going to be able to come into our home and manage our equipment. And so they've created something called a home area network, which includes all these kinds of devices that are there that you and I will own, but they will control. I understand where they're coming from. I understand what the issues are. I also understand that within 5 years, they're not going to be doing that because technology is going to make it possible for us to have automated response devices that we control, and it's not going to take us any time to control. It's not like the blinking light on your VCR, and it's not like the programmable thermostat that nobody used. This is all enabled by communications, and those of you that have smartphones know what you can do with small apps. So here's a picture that has gotten national attention, and it basically shows the utility-owned infrastructure on one side, the AMI infrastructure, talking to the home. And there's all sorts of devices, but what I want to tell you is that part of the big problem is that in the marketplace today, there's a huge number of communications protocols available. The utilities are pushing one called Zigbee, but it's probably dead on arrival. They're not going to tell you that, but that's a prediction I'm making, and you'll see that within a year or so, technology is just going to wipe it out. But with this picture in mind, which I'm not spending a lot of time on, let me just take one moment to be sure you know what a communications protocol is. Communications protocols were created as a 7-layer model when the telecom industry was deregulating. And this allowed the deregulation to be sensible and deterministic in terms of what the regulators understood and what the technologists understood. We still have to get to that point, or we're trying to get to that point in electricity deregulation. It hasn't happened for us yet. These 7 layers are easily understood as 3 layers. Basically, the applications, which are software, network transport, which is basically what you know as the internet. That's one version of that. And then some sort of physical things, like 2 tin cans and a waxed wire, a wireless system that is based on some sort of electronics. So those 3 categories are what you have to understand. And then Zigbee is a standard IEEE physical layer. It's developing IETF Internet Protocol versions, and it's developing some software at the upper layers, which is called the Smart Energy Profile. All of this stuff is going to be superseded, in my mind, by OpenADR and by the Internet and Wi-Fi, which is already... The reason for Zigbee is because a few years ago, Wi-Fi and all of these capabilities were not as good as they needed to be. Today, they are going to surpass Zigbee, and Zigbee is going to be subsumed by Wi-Fi, OpenADR, XML, a lot of other standards. So with this in mind, the state never knew what a reference design was. If you've been in Silicon Valley, you live by reference designs. And so the state finally funded, with Professor Auslander heading up the team, funded a programmable communicating thermostat reference design. It was tested in prototype form, and it had a number of functions. But today there's actually a product in the marketplace that actually follows that design and is leading a revolution in what should have been obvious to a lot of people in the beginning, but wasn't. On the back, notice what's on the back. This is expansion ports, just like you have on PCs, which are USB. or on the old IBM PC, which was RS-232, thermostats are going to be communication agnostic until we can get to a default communication standard. And this kind of technology is already in the marketplace. General Electric is going to apply it to appliances, and it's called USNAP. Utility System Networks Application Port, something like that. We can get the same kinds of responses with PCTs that we got with energy management systems in the large commercial industrial sector. So, what do regulators have to decide with respect to technology? Well, here's the picture. Just watch this picture. This is my view of the way things should be, my personal view. Utilities own everything on their side of the meter. I own everything on my side of the meter. But what's going on right now is a discussion about, should the utilities own the thermostat? Should the utilities own your appliances? Should the utilities own your pool pump? This is where I'm challenging you to get involved. Maybe they should. Maybe I'm wrong. But I don't think they should. I think that, in fact, technology should allow us to be able to do this on our own, and we should be able to respond to prices and to reliability signals. So, in summary, technology is not the problem. Many of you are technologists. You're one of the greatest universities in the world, and you all know that there's great stuff going on. System integration should be our focus because we've got a lot of technologies. We've got to figure out how to put them together. Standards are being developed on national level. We need to incorporate that in, and regulators need to define the what, and industry will define the how. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron, for your perspective. So I'm going to open the floor to questions.
That was an amazing job, Ron, in the time allowed and under the constraints that you operated under. Good job. Thank you.
I guess I don't need to stand up. There are no cameras, right? Excellent talk, Ron. I want to, you surprised me with your almost next to last slide about where the ownership boundaries are going. This
Yep.
one. I had understood that the utilities are going to own the smart meters, and then everything on the other side of that, the consumers own, but the utilities might not care. If they can have the remote control, right, for their system reliabilities and load response via the meters, at least, maybe into the thermostats, then all the consumer-owned stuff and all the feedback technology and so forth, it might be interesting and important, but it's not the utility's main game. So can you clarify exactly what debate is going on here, and sort of legally and regulatorily what it is about?
So the utilities have something called open HAN that they're doing right now, in which they will tell the industry how to design this thermostat, and they will, because what they want is something that they can control directly, and they want security, a completely secure, cyber-secure link to that thermostat. That's going to raise the price of this by double. And the alternate solution is, Cisco and other people, you have routers in your home. You can securely get to your router with a signal, which then gets transported around, that would be a gateway into your home, to the thermostat to get the same effect, but instead of having a control signal, it could give you a signal where you, in fact, have the choice. Not you personally, you've already told this thing what you want to do, which you can override at any time. But you can say, if the price gets above 40 cents, set my set point up 4 degrees, if it's air conditioning, or dim some lights, or do whatever you want to do, whatever your control is. In this paradigm where they do it, they'll pay you an amount, an incentive, and you can accept it. And I'm not against it if you want to do it. I'm just saying they should not have the ownership of that much. I'm saying that that's something that people should weigh in on and think about. Because once that happens, and they're talking about this. So this isn't something I've made up. These are in discussions. Most of the focus has been just on that one, on the thermostat. But they're talking about having this kind of control all the way to your appliances. The way it's being done right now is not by authority, but by momentum. So they're pushing a number of alliances. There's 13 utilities that represent 28% of the load in the United States that are pushing something called the Zigbee Home Plug Alliance, and they're trying to get a de facto standard in place that would automatically create that. And Regulators, I've talked to a number of them, they're clueless. They're just clueless. They don't understand. They don't, first of all, they don't know what Zigbee is. They don't know what a 7-layer model is. They don't know where. The 7-layer model is extremely important because you have to understand at least the 3 layers to understand who owns what. And I've heard a regulator get up and say these exact words at PJM. Zigbee enables the consumer to control their own loads. Z-Wave does too, so do others. But the question is whether they understand that Z-Wave enables something they may not want. So that's a question. So my perspective is people need to weigh in, regulators need to become more involved in the technology.
Well, in terms of a layer, there needs to be a layer which is the information interface between the utility device and the home device, which there seems to be an assumption that all of the thing that needs to be communicated is a price. But there's all sorts of information that could be communicated that would give advantage in terms of potential future prices or who knows what information. What type of protocols are being worked on to expand the amount of information going between the 2 devices?
That's an extremely good question. This is the level of, so look at this picture here. California Energy Commission has been trying to say, okay, this is a nice little connection into the home, the Zigbee or something equivalent connection, but this is a very narrow pipe. This is a very limited pipe. What the California Energy Commission would like to do, and the CPUC isn't on board on this 100%, is that third party, you should be able to get it through your router. You should be able to get it through any sort of a broadcast system. There should be options to do it. That's what USNAP is all about. Make devices protocol neutral, agnostic, and I think you said the words earlier, you need standard information models, but you don't need to have standard protocols. The utilities are pushing a standard protocol and putting their information model on top, which has load control. So Smart Energy Profile 1.0 is a load control application. If you go to the CPUC and ask the people if they understand that, you'll find out they don't. So did I answer your question? We would like to see Wi-Fi and other, DSL, cable, satellite. You notice I have PSTN in there. Obviously, that's going to not happen. But there should be options.
Is anybody doing it? Is my real question.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Won't talk about the details, but one of the names of this building, who was the founder of Marvell, right? They're working on Wi-Fi solutions that are going to blow everybody's socks off. Those solutions are going to be better than anything Zigbee can offer. And you're going to get Wi-Fi for it. And you're going to be able to deal with XML and other standards, whereas Zigbee is very anecdotal. And so this is really important. So I think when these announcements are made, it's going to shake up the utilities. I think some of them already know.
If it's okay, I'd like to move back into the historical portion for a couple of minutes, if that's all right. During the crisis, I actually was working at the State Public Utilities Commission and directed the investigation of what was going on in the wholesale markets, and I wanted to offer a couple of friendly amendments.
Okay.
If that's all right.
Please.
Yeah, first of all, of course, although there was legislation in 1996, deregulation didn't actually commence until 1998. At the end of March, which is an important distinction because the impression otherwise is that things hummed along for 4 years and then suddenly we had a crisis when in fact within about 6 months there were blips in prices and then within 24 months there was a steady crisis in terms of both price and supply. Second of all, Enron has never owned any power plants in California, and that's I think an important distinction as well because it really wasn't the generators that were at the core of the problem so much as the marketers who had a hub and spoke capability where they could go and collect supplies from various places and then manage what was introduced into the market at various times. The third thing is that, and this is really more a matter of opinion, I think that demand response, as important as it would be to help manage supply, would not have had a dramatic impact likely on price. And that's really for a couple of reasons. First, as you mentioned, for instance, the brownouts that occurred actually were in the wintertime. And yes, there were plants taken down for maintenance. But if you were to track the supply and demand on a day-to-day basis, you can see how the supply during the crisis kept shrinking whenever there was a sense that the demand was going to be lower. And I think that in response to demand response, that phenomena still would have occurred, and the price supply still would have shrunk. But the other piece of evidence in that direction, I think, is that the crisis actually ended without the retail rates ever being unfrozen. It was really two things that caused the crisis to end, and they both came from FERC. One was that FERC insisted that suppliers who had generation make that generation available unless the plant was demonstrably wounded and couldn't come online. And the second thing was to put a price cap, fairly high price cap, but a cap nonetheless. And then the last factor I just want to mention is that, of course, there actually were no blackouts. There were brownouts, which really were load reduction. Unfortunately, it was involuntary load reduction instead of voluntary load reduction. And with a good demand response program in place, those reductions hopefully could have been voluntary instead.
Except for the blackouts, I agree with everything. There were blackouts in the valley. There were rolling blackouts. There were a couple in the valley because at least a friend of mine lived in one of the houses where everything was shut down.
We take one more.
So I don't know. You may be right. I do remember that mostly were brownouts.
Maybe we should take one more question, Damon, in the interest of time.
I want to go back to the boundary that you drew there between what the utility controls and what you think the customers control. And the question is whether under your proposal there'll still be the capability for the customer to surrender control of appliances like air conditioners or water pools over to the utility, because there is definitely a benefit for load control, because then you can stagger when you can group the loads and have some sort of a rotating usage of that capability, or so that having that option would be worth something. And in a good plan you would actually pay a premium to a customer that is willing to surrender his appliances for direct load control, because then the ISO can rely on that in managing the load. So the question is whether the technology that you are proposing would still enable the customer to surrender that control without standardizing those thermostats or the device beyond the line.
The answer is yes, and the way it would be done is that that's all captured in a special module that PG&E or Southern California Edison would have with sticking in, and all the security issues they need could be put on that. And the rest of the thermostat can become standard, and the information model has to have the ability to send control signals, which would be picked up by a PG&E specific thing, which they would just mail to you. You'd stick it into your thermostat or whatever, and you'd be on that program. So yes, whether they do that or not, I don't know. But yes, we don't want to eliminate load control out of this paradigm.
Just a quick comment. There is a middle ground there as well, in the sense that if this device has a bit more smarts and a bit more communication capabilities, the utility can, rather than turn on and off a particular appliance, can give a load signal and say, I want you to maintain no more than 2.6 kilowatts, and the device will maintain it according to user preferences. So that's a middle ground between direct load control and no load control.
We're not trying, just to be clear, we're not trying in any way to impose any view. We're trying to put an architecture out there that, in fact, encompasses all of those views. There's going to be a transition period. One of the things we said that I put on my slide, we have to be compatible with all legacy systems going forward. You don't change all of this overnight. This is like a 10 to 20 year kind of transition for a lot of equipment. So it has to support load control.
Thank you, Ron.
As a compliment to Ron, I think I should tell you that we had 25 people on the web that hung in there and waited for you to come back. So they were well rewarded, I must say.
Thanks. Thank you.